I have made plenty of videos about how to make time-lapses and hyperlapses, both with drones and with regular cameras. I will add the link at the end of this one. A lot of you asked me to show how I post-process them. In this video I will show my post-processing routine for time-lapses and hyperlapses. In the past I've used mostly Lightroom, After Effects and sometimes LR time-lapse. Here I will show the workflow using the free version of Davinci Resolve, but the same concept can be applied to most video editors. There are 7 major steps involved when post-processing time-lapses: importing the file, color grading, correct distortion, Stabilise, Deflicker, Denoise, keyframing to add some movement, and encoding. There is plenty of stuff to analyze and I cannot go very deep in all of them. I will do some specific videos on topics like color grading, stabilizing and keyframing. So don't forget to subscribe to my channel to be notified. Let's get going. The first choice is whether to use RAW or JPEG files. I always use RAW files as they contain more info and respond much better to color correction. The only downside is that they are a bit more demanding in terms of computer resources. So if you have a basic laptop, you might want to use JPEG. I believe Davinci Resolve only imports RAW file in DNG format, although all my cameras and drones produce DNG files. If you have RAW files in other format, you can easily convert them to DNG using Adobe Digital Negative Converter, a free program. To import the image for a time-lapse, we tap on the icon Media, on the left at the bottom of the page. Now at the top left we can navigate our hard drive. I always put each time-lapse in an individual folder. If I click one of my time-lapse folders, Davinci Resolve recognizes it as a sequence of files and shows a single thumbnail with the name of the first and the last file. The files must be numbered as a numeric sequence. In the rare occasion when they are numbered in a different way, I use Adobe Bridge to batch rename them. Color post-processing has always been a strong point of Davinci Resolve. It includes a huge amount of powerful tools. I will publish several videos about color post-processing in Davinci Resolve, but for the purpose of this one, I will keep things as simple as possible. At the bottom of the screen we click on the 5th icon from the left to enter the color workspace. In the menu above the panel on the lower left, we have a choice for different interfaces for color correction. We will be using the third from the left, color wheels. In the window on the lower right, we have several ways to visualize the luminosity and the color values in the image. I prefer to set it to parade. This image certainly needs much more contrast, as you can see from the waveforms bunched up in the middle range. One way to add it is to use the contrast slider, but I prefer instead to lower the shadows and lift the highlights, while checking the waveform on the right panel. We want the lower part to touch the value 0, while the higher would be close to the upper limit, but not quite touching it. To modify the contrast we can also use the curves in the central windows. There is definitely a blue dominant. It might be interesting to add some orangey red to the dark shadow to increase the chromatic contrast. We can do so by pushing the dot in the lift wheel towards the desired color. Then we can warm up the white balance just a touch using the temp slider and finally add a bit of saturation. And now I'm happy with the result. So far we've applied only static adjustment, but in many cases in time-lapses we also need dynamic adjustment, as the light conditions often change during the time of shooting the photos. In order to do that, we need to have a first look at nodes. This other time-lapse of mighty Mount Etna was shot at sunrise, so the luminosity will change drastically from the beginning to the end, as well as the white balance. First we quickly do some static adjustment on the first frame of the time-lapse. Then we go to the Nodes panel. If you don't have it on the top right of your screen, click the Nodes icon on top. Now we right-click on the node and choose Add Node, Add Serial. We can also right-click and choose Node Label to name it Dynamic. This node will contain the adjustment that we want to vary during our time-lapse. In order to do that, we will use keyframes. We make sure that the second node is selected with a red outline. Then we open the keyframe panel by clicking on this icon. Since our node for dynamic adjustment is the second one, we open Corrector 2 in the menu to the left to see all the tools that can be affected by the keyframes. We then click on Color Corrector, as this is the one we will be working on. We bring the playhead to the first frame, if it is not already there, and choose Dynamic Keyframe. This kind of keyframe goes gradually from the value of the previous keyframe to the one of the next one, smoothing all the points in between. While if we choose Static Keyframe, the values will change abruptly when the second keyframe is met. Now all the color adjustments we have done have been memorized for the first keyframe. We can bring the playhead to the last frame. As you can see, the image is now way too bright, because we're about 15 minutes later in the sunrise. We now make all the adjustments needed. We start by lowering a good deal the overall luminosity. Notice that as soon as we modify a value, a keyframe is automatically inserted at the position of the playhead. There is too much orange in the highlights, so we push gain towards the blue, we lift the shadows and we increase the saturation. Now if we play the clip, the transition of light is much smoother. A major issue in time-lapses, especially one taken with drone, is distortion. I always start my time-lapse workflow by bringing the files to Lightroom, when I can apply lens profiles for correcting the distortion on most lenses for traditional cameras. So my time-lapse made with my Nikon D850 are all distortion-free. But for some drones there are no specific profiles, and also drones tend to have a bigger amount of distortion due to the wide lenses. When shooting a static time-lapse, if the drone shifts too much while hovering, we will have to stabilize the image. But after stabilizing, the edge of the image tends to move independently from the center, creating warping. This is an extreme example shot with a drone that needed badly some calibration and therefore was moving all over the place while shooting. In Davinci Resolve Studio, the premium version, there is a lens correction tool that analyzes the footage and automatically corrects the distortion. It works very well with just a single click. In the free version, we can go to the Fusion panel, make sure that the media in node is highlighted, then we hold the Shift key and hit the spacebar to access this tool selection menu, where we can choose Lens Distort. On the panel to the right, we open Lens Distortion Model, where we can use the distortion slider to adjust the image. This method works quite well if we have a strong reference point, like the sea in the horizon, But in most scenes we don't have any reliable reference. If you are into time-lapse with drone, it is a very good idea to take a picture containing some sort of geometrical grid, correct manually the distortion in Davinci Resolve, memorize the value, and then apply the same values for any time-lapse with that specific drone. Of course, if needed, you can do the same for a specific lens on a traditional camera that has too much distortion, if you don't have access to the lens profiles in Lightroom. It is crucial to correct distortion before stabilizing. For time-lapses shot with a traditional camera sitting on a sturdy tripod, in general we don't need any stabilization, unless in very windy conditions, or if we have manually modified the exposure values during the shot, maybe in case of sunrise or sunset. But with a drone hovering for a static time-lapse, there is always a certain amount of shifting, and stabilization is always needed. It is also needed in most hyperlapses made both with drones and ground-based cameras. So in the edit screen, make sure that the inspector is on by clicking on this icon, and then choose Video on the menu below. There is a function Stabilisation that can be opened by clicking on the left to reveal several parameters. We have three different modes: perspective, similarity, and translation. Zoom allows some cropping, which is always needed, so we will leave it always ticked. Then we have three sliders for cropping ratio, smooth, and strength. Most of these tools apply to hyperlapse, but for the purpose of this tutorial I will concentrate only on time-lapses, which are the one with a fixed point of view, in other words, with a static camera. It will take too much time to show how to stabilize hyperlapse, and I will do it on a specific video. In the case of static time-lapses, we always want the box next to Camera Lock. You can see that all other options are now grayed out. All we need to do is click on the icon Stabilise. This tool is extremely fast. With my computer it took me less than a minute to stabilize this time-lapse, much faster than any other software. The result is good. As you can see, the image has been cropped very deeply. This is not surprising, considering the amount of movement in the original time-lapse. For this reason, it is better to plan in advance and frame wider. In this case, I was not interested in the village below. I wanted to focus on the movement of the clouds, so I'm happy with it. The image now is much more stable. There are just a couple of little jumps, but it will be easy to fix them using keyframes. This other time-lapse had a huge amount of movement. It was shot with my Mavic 2 Pro. I had not used this drone for several weeks, and it was badly needing some calibration. It was drifting a lot while taking the shots. You can see that after stabilizing, the movement has been certainly reduced and the image has been cropped a good deal. But there is still too much lateral movement and rotation. In this case, a more complex workflow is needed, involving keyframes and tracking, besides stabilization. Flicker is often an issue with time-lapses. The camera has to take a certain amount of photos at a given exposure setting, but with many lenses the value for aperture is not exactly the same at each shot. Therefore there can be some slight difference in luminosity from one shot to the next. When shooting a single photo, the difference is too small to be noticed. But in a time-lapse the photos are played back at very fast speed, and a different luminosity can cause flashes and be very disturbing. Davinci Resolve has an excellent Deflicker, but it is only available in the studio version, not in the free one. But the studio version of Davinci Resolve costs about $300. It must be said that includes plenty of excellent features and is definitely worth it if you do a lot of video processing. Another solution is Neat Video. It is a plugin for noise reduction and deflickering. The version for Davinci Resolve costs €80 here in Europe. I suppose the same in dollar. I use Neat Video in every single clip and I found it sensational. Please refer to my in-depth video about it. With my Nikon DF50 and with the new generation of drones, I hardly ever get any flicker. But Neat Video not only gets rid of noise and flicker, but it also solves an issue specific to drones. In this time-lapse, the props of the drone got somehow into the shot, and as you can see, totally ruined the clip. I used Neat Video and after a few seconds, the propeller disappeared from the clip. Magic! Noise is another issue with time-lapses, especially in low light, or when we need to increase the contrast in post-production. As I mentioned earlier, I use Neat Video for every single time-lapse or video, but the studio version of Davinci Resolve has a sensational noise reduction tool, almost as good as Neat Video. In the free version of Davinci Resolve there is a tool for noise reduction. It does a decent job, although nowhere near the power of the two tools mentioned above. Here is how it works. In this time-lapse there was plenty of haze, so I had to increase the contrast a lot. This brought in a huge amount of noise, especially in the sky. In the edit window of Davinci Resolve we right-click on our clip and choose New Fusion Clip. We then move to the Fusion window. We have two nodes. We select the one to the left, Media In. We hold down Shift and hit the spacebar and choose Remove Noise from the menu. We now have this menu where we can act on the individual colors. This is useful when we have an evident chromatic noise of a specific color, but in this case we want to act upon the three colors at once, so we tick the box next to Lock. We push the slider softness to the right and we can see that some noise is disappearing. But also the image is getting blurred, so we push detail to the right until the softness is gone. In most programs this sort of adjustment must be very subtle, but I find that with this denoiser we have to go very far. Since the clip was very noisy, we could push it all the way to the right. There is still a good amount of noise, even though less than before, so we move to Chroma and do the same. After denoising, the time-lapse is certainly much better, although there is definitely some noise left. If you're aiming mostly to shoot time-lapses for social media, the denoiser supplied with the free version of DVR is good enough. But if you do it for professional reasons, I definitely suggest going for Neat Video or the studio version of Davinci Resolve. Keyframes are extremely useful in video for a lot of different purposes. Here I will show a very simple example. The idea is to add a bit of extra movement to a static time-lapse by slowly zooming in. The same kind of effect can be used to animate a single photo and is known as a can burn effect. It is extremely simple and good fun. This is a time-lapse in the main street of Valletta in Malta. Let's say that we want to zoom in progressively to give the idea of the camera walking along the street. In the edit page we bring the playhead to the beginning of the clip. In the top right window there should be this menu transform. If you don't see it, click on the inspector icon at the top. And then on video on the menu below. And scroll the menu to the top. Now we click on this diamond to the right of zoom and also to the one next to position. We have added a keyframe at the first frame of the clip for the two values. Now we move to the end of the clip and we enter another value for zoom. The maximum zoom level depends on the resolution of your camera. For this timelapse I've used my trusty Nikon D850, which has plenty of resolution. So I know I can easily go to 200% zoom without any loss of quality. If we play the timelapse, the value of the zoom is smoothly increasing from the amount specified in the first keyframe to the one of the last one. But it looks like the camera is pointing straight ahead at the beginning and progressively going up a bit toward the sky. So we can go to the last frame and move the Y value for position down until the camera is again facing straight ahead. Now it really looks like we were walking on the street while shooting forward. Finally, we need to encode our finished timelapse to get a video file that we can use for our purposes. So we go to the Deliver workspace. We click on the icon of our timelapse. Using these arrows to the right, we go to the beginning of our clip and we click to set an in point. Then we go to the end and we set an out point. Only the portion included within these points will be encoded. On the menu to the left, we give it a name. We navigate to the location in the hard drive where we want to save it. Then in the menu above we can choose a pre-made format, including some popular social media, or else we can manually choose the different parameters, or make our custom formats. In this case I choose YouTube 2160, which is 4K, and then hit the button Add to Render Queue. The file appears in the render queue on the top right, and we can hit Render All. I will certainly go much more in depth on each specific topics analyzed here in upcoming videos, so don't forget to subscribe to my channel to be notified. Bye for now.